So, in any case, usually the first step is about the clarifying and the preliminary questions, right? So, in the PNL also, we have to see what are the preliminary questions. So, there are two questions here that we have in front of us. First of all, how many questions we should ask, and then what should be those questions. So, what is answered here? Okay, let's first have a discussion on how many. Okay, and this discussion is pertinent to the market entry cases also. Okay, whereas in market entry and guesstimate you usually ask more questions up front, right, because the problems are more unstructured, more unclear. In this case you could do with lesser questions. Okay, so what you have to do here is figure out how many questions to ask, right, and this is a very common doubt that people have. So I would say that you have to use two parameters. Okay, one is ambiguity and the second is structure. Okay, so definitely ask enough questions that there is no ambiguity left. Make sure that for you and the interviewer every term means the same thing and all the parameters of the case are clear in terms of what they mean. Second point is that you should ask only enough number of questions that are required to structure the problem. A lot of people start solving, there's no clear distinction between them asking initial questions and them solving the problem, right? So it's useful to only ask those questions which will help you make that initial structure that we talked about of the revenue and the cost, and then all the subsequent questions that you have can be now be made part of that structure as and when required. Okay, so I hope the question of how many is answered. There's no clear cut solution or a number that you can put there that you should ask only 3 or 5, because if the case is more ambiguous you might have to ask more questions, right? You can try to read the body language of the interviewer and see if they are getting impatient, right? Or you could have a mental check for yourself. Okay, I'm not going to spend more than a minute and a half on asking or clarifying initial things. Okay, so don't solve the problem right there, only just structure it. Okay, so with enough practice that you do, you can perhaps come closer to the idea of asking how many questions is useful. Okay, now let's look at what those questions can be. Okay, so like in the market entry preliminary question video, here also I've divided into three parts: essential clarifications, secondary clarifications, and some specific clarifications. Essential clarifications are things that definitely you should know once you start entering the case. Secondary clarifications are those which might be useful or not depending on the type of case that you have, and then specific are more specific than the secondary questions. I should just put it that way. Okay, so the first two questions go hand in hand. If your problem is ambiguous, or remember the last video in which I said ABC X% loss for Y time period, right? So the first two questions are figuring out X and Y. Sometimes the question is vague. They could be, so company ABC is facing a loss for some time and you have to figure out why this is happening. So is facing a loss, that has to be quantified in terms of what percentage. Okay, so what is the extent of the loss or the abnormal profit as the case might be, and how long has the problem persisted for. So when this is some time, you have to zero it down. Okay, this is very important because like in the previous video we discussed that we have to do two critical comparisons, one with our own history, right? To do that comparison you need to know for how long this problem has persisted. Okay, and if the problem is, let's say, only for a period of last 2 months versus 5 years, you can perhaps understand that a 5-year problem is not due to hysteresis in the economy, whereas a 2-month problem can be. A 5-year problem could be more structural in nature. So having a sense of the extent of the problem in terms of temporal time period, in terms of the time period, could be crucial to give more direction to the questions that you ask. The second is asking about what is the extent of the loss, right? As you can logically realize that a 2% loss versus a 25% loss, right? They are going to be different, right? First of all, the cause is going to be different, and then your final recommendations are going to be different, right? A slight increase in the price of electricity is not going to cause 25% loss, whereas slight increase in electricity or the labor cost might cost -2%, right? So if you know that you have a higher degree of losses that you are dealing with, then your structure and the kind of questions you will ask will change compared to this. And again, the recommendations will also change, because if you have a -25% loss, then perhaps you might focus more on the short term recommendation, right? Because you definitely have to bring this number down ASAP and then look at the long term, right? Whereas with the 2% loss, the urgency is not there, so you might give less short term recommendations and more long term recommendations. Okay, so make sure that these 2 points are absolutely clear if they are not given. And the third essential question, right? So sometimes people prefer to ask this later on also, right? If the problem is of a consumer good or something which is quite visible to me, it's a relatable product, then I usually ask this question about whether it is industry specific, company specific, so that I have more idea as I start making my structure. Okay, also I want to figure out the difference between, like I discussed in the previous video, if I am facing -20% loss, a loss of 20%, I want to figure what the industry is facing. If they are facing -5, if they are facing a loss of 5%, then I have two problems. One, figuring out the overall external environment, and the second is to figure out why we are suffering far more than the external environment. Okay, so these three questions are useful upfront. The secondary set of questions could be, what exactly is the product, the channel, and the point of sale? So if you're not clear on the product, you should definitely ask this question. And it is useful to know what the channels and the points of sale are. So you might want to understand, okay, are we selling offline, online, or not? You could ask this question later on also, when you have broken down your problem into cost and revenue you have broken it down to dollar and value, and now when you're trying to dollar and volume, and now when you're trying to segment the volume, you could ask for channels and point of sale there also. So it's up to you, depending on the type of the case and your comfort with these questions. Second, how is the process spread across geographies and where do we lie in that? So essentially I am asking two questions here: where do we lie in the value chain, and also where exactly is the value chain located, right? So this is a useful exercise you can do. If you can merge your two questions into one question, right, it can essentially reduce the number of questions you are asking. Okay, so geography is important, like I've discussed in market entry also, specifically in the case of India, because if you have a product which say that it is sold in India, that does not tell you a lot of information. You also want to know whether it's sold in rural India and urban India both, or in urban, specifically metros. Or it might be the case that you have an MNC company and their raw material might be coming from country A, their production is happening in country B, and their main market might be country C. So raw material from country A, production in country B, and final market is country C, right? So if this is the case and you have not understood this upfront, it might happen that it's only 5, 7, 10 minutes into the case that you come up with this observation, and by that time you might have already wasted enough time for the case to get impacted negatively. So it can be a very useful question to ask for an MNC firm and even for an India specific firm. Okay, so again, what regions and who are the customers? Okay, so if the product, so this follows from the product, right? If the product is not very clear to you, then it could be useful to ask who the customers are. Okay, sometimes for products like, let's say, toys, the consumers are also of two types, right? It is the toddler who plays with the toy and the parent who buys it, right? Or in some cases it could be that the product is used by employees but is bought by the company, right? So understand the distinction that customers can also be of two types: the one who pays the one who uses. So if your case is very specific, you would want to divide this and understand. Okay. Now let's look at the last part, which are the specific clarifications, right? So these are going to be used in very rare cases, right? But sometimes in a profit and loss case, you are specifically told that okay, specifically if it's a growth oriented profit and loss case, that company A wants to go into geography B, okay, then you might want to understand why they are trying to think of this strategy, right? So that you get more inputs to structure your problem. So this is akin to the market entry cases that we have discussed. And is it the only business or product or concern for us, right? So essentially I'm looking at complementarity from two angles. First, the complementarity might be the source of the problem, or it could be a source of solution, right? So let's say that we have the case that we produce tires for cars, right? And the problem ostensibly talks about only tires, right? But you also figure out that okay, we sell tires for trucks also, right? So there are two different product lines, and you finally figure out that the car market is going to collapse. Then your possible recommendation could be okay, then let's use the raw material and the expertise that we already have into the truck market. So it's in a very rare case that you would have to ask this question upfront, but just keep this in your kitty and you can perhaps ask this later also. Okay, so all of these questions are very pertinent. Some of them you will ask at the beginning of the case, some you might ask as the case proceeds forward, and some you might want to keep towards the end. Okay, so I hope this discussion helped you, and look at the other videos also on the channel for your case study prep. Best of luck and thank you.